So welcome to the latest trend in web frameworks. My name is Doris Chen. For those of you who may not know, I'm a developer evangelist at Microsoft. And really, I'm a web person. I have been working on the web space for over 10 years. I have been with Microsoft for about 5 years. My focus is on HTML5, JavaScript, and frameworks. And before that, I was a Java evangelist at Sun Microsystem for many years, worked with Java community. A couple of things was to point out is the presentation I usually will post on my blog. The first link there is my blog URL, but if you don't remember, that's totally fine. I don't remember that either. If you do a search, Doris space MSDN, then usually the top 2 links, one of the links is my blog address. My Twitter is Doris T. Chen. There's a T in the middle. Make sure you put a T there. And then follow the Microsoft standard. It's doris.chen@microsoft.com. That's my email. Feel free to send me some feedback. All right, so I'd like to get some of your background. I set up this course as like a beginner level, but some of the content could go like into intermediate as well as a little advanced. So I'd like to get some idea. Are you all web developers here? Okay. HTML, JavaScript, CSS? Okay, very good. Okay, so as you can see, we have a pretty busy agenda. I want to start from the beginning level, talk about what is a single page application, SPA, and talk about what's the difference between a framework versus a library. Also talk about some of the design patterns associated with that, and then go over a list of the most popular JavaScript web frameworks in general, and focus on the Angular and Backbone, which are the top 2 most popular frameworks. And then go through a code called a to-do app. And if we have more time, I'd love to show you how you could port the web application really easily into the mobile space. So it will be an app running on the mobile devices. Okay, are you ready? We're gonna kind of like go a little fast pace, depends on your background. So how many of you never heard of SPA? Okay, a couple of you, okay. Okay, cool. SPA stands for many things, right? Depends on what you talk about. But here we talk about a single page application, SPA. And then if you look at that, it's actually a very simple concept. It's a single page. And then normally in a web space, you give a request and you're getting the response, the full page is getting back, right? And then you click on button, again, the full page is getting back. This is normally in a browser and a server kind of communication. This is what we see a lot. Now, started with quite a few years when people start to talk about Ajax, right? Why we need Ajax? How many of you actually, tried Ajax to start with? Okay, Ajax is because when we give a request, click on a link, click on a button, I don't have to refresh the whole page. I only change partially of that page. Right? So it's only a partial response I need to get it back. Hence, because if I only need to change the partial page, my performance is much better because a lot of content is very static. It will stay on that page. Only the dynamic part I change partially need to update. So this is really why we need to talk about a single page application. The thing is we need to apply for the real-time response like a mobile device, right? We talk about native kind of device. We want a really good performance, right? So, so SPA has been really, it is a web page, of course, but then the concept started as early as the Ajax time, right? Partial screen update, that's a key thing. And then it's used a lot, used like we want to do have a native like app kind of experience for loading the page, better user experience, as well as doing some smart loading, all those things. Everything you see it on app, run on native device. We want a web to have the similar experience. That's why we want to talk about that. And then normally, we will talk about it in more detail, but it's really, the data is separated from presentation. That's how we could get it done, right? And then a lot of examples you already see, like a Twitter, right? Email in most of the browser-based application. And then if you ever go to Microsoft Azure, the portal is actually using SPA kind of model. So pretty easy concept, right? So all the frameworks, JavaScript-based we're talking about today is all based on SPA. Okay, so some of the challenges with SPA, some of them I already talked about. Because we live in a big world, we want to support multiple devices, right? The browser running on a desktop might be different from a browser running on a phone or tablet, right? So we need to support multiple clients. And then the other thing is it's a single page. It's not really easy to refresh all the time, right? So we don't really know the history. We don't know if we click a back button, what's going to happen, because it does not automatically record or keep track of all your previous state, right? And also, what if somebody disable the JavaScript button, possible in your browser, right? Then all the JavaScript won't be running. So many things, you have to sort of like think about it when you have a SPA kind of architecture, kind of application. So hence, people has been working on that for many years. And then I know a lot of people are confused about when we talk about framework, we talk about libraries, what are the fundamental difference, right? Let's get a little clarification on these terms. So libraries is really something, is really try to fit into an app already has existing architecture. Libraries not try to help you to do the architect part, right? It basically try to help you to fit into one particular module and focus on a specific task or specific operation. For example, jQuery, we're all familiar. jQuery is a library, and it really helps with a DOM manipulation. This is a specific task it has, right? And really, it really organized into a class with different kind of functions there, right? That's what library is. Framework is really, I like to see it could define not just module, but also the architect. So it could help you to do the architecture so you don't have to do the design. It already have all the architecture there and then also define individual module so you could leverage all those things. This is a framework. So I like to think about framework is actually bigger, right? And covers more things. Framework usually is really something like provide what we call abstract design based on the basic behavior. And also it really could take a lot of common requests, right? You could actually develop a project. You could come out with a framework, right? Because a project probably have a lot of requirement you want to resolve, right? So library, framework, these are two different things. So when I get along, I would say this is a framework, this is a library, right? Okay, so benefits of the frameworks, obviously, it gives you the architecture, has a benefit of that, right? So that's very handy. And then you could actually, getting different team, right, to work on different modules based on the same architecture. So really, it's encouraging team collaboration. All those things are good. Whereas the library, maybe just use the library, right? You don't talk about collaboration, all those things. The testability, maintainability would be much better if you have a framework, right? That's why a lot of people, especially for the past 2 years, a lot of frameworks come out. Okay, so next I'd like to move just a little bit because now I have about 75 minutes. Normally, if it's a 50 minutes talk, I won't have time to talk about that. How many of you never heard about MVC? Okay, I'll just really briefly go over that. Most people all heard about that, MVC. It is such a classical design pattern introduced in 1970. The key thing here is it's a separation concerns. We want to make sure the controller, the models are decoupled from the view. That's a key concept. Separation of concern, that's a key thing. All right, so I love to use a very simple example. Let's say, simply say login panel, right? Login panel could be implemented with an MVC pattern, right? So first of all, through the view, user put a username, password. The controller part is going to take the data through the view from the user input, and then going to do the what they call the logical process, right? They're going to actually probably check with the backend, the model, to see if that username and the password are correct. And then they could do multiple response, 3 things usually, right? So they could say, compared to the model, the username password does not match. So I'm going to send that decision basically is say, login failed. So that particular data piece is going to send back to the view. So the view is going to display login failed. The controller could also say, I could not find any of the information of the username. It could be a new account, right? So I ask the view to display something to sign in for a new account. Or it could say, login successful, right? So basically, login panel is actually use MVC. Controller is doing the logic processing with the help of the model. It could help to do the decision. All the decisions send it back to the view. So view basically display the data based on controller gives. This is a very classical MVC kind of design pattern, right? Obviously, people still use it a lot, right? But one thing to sort of look into is this particular classical pattern has been extended to different models as well. So next, we're going to actually talk about MVVM. How many of you heard about MVVM? Yeah, so quite a lot of you heard about that because MVVM is what? Is actually the pattern so that you would be able to do two-way binding. How many of you heard about two-way binding? Yes, this is actually based on MVVM, right? So if you look at this diagram, right, not a really major change. The change here is probably the view model. You will see view model seem like it try to take care the controller kind of behavior, and it's not exactly a controller, but it try to serve as a controller kind of function. This is a view model. So if you look at that, it's very clear picture. View model and view leads to providing the basic of the two-way binding. And then all the changes in the view model will be automatically propagate through the state of view model and then to the view. And on the other hand, view model will use a pattern called observer pattern to notify all the changes inside of view model to the model, right? So basically, if you look at that, there is some change involved, right? I'll talk about a little more difference in terms of view model later on. But then if you look at a model is all the same, right? Defining the business logic about that data, defining the way to access data, to change and manipulate the business data. This is a model, what a model does, right? View here is also very traditional, is using a few of UI components, using HTML, JavaScript, CSS to represent those UI components. So that's what happened in the view, right? So view part, the thing is view part is only taking data from the view model, right? And then display it. It doesn't have to think about why I'm displaying those things. No, it doesn't. I'm getting the data from view model. This is what I'm supposed to display. So this is what the view will show. So the view model here does a little bit more work, right? So basically it has to sort of like manipulate with all the state and exchange data, work with a model, right? That's one thing. Second thing is the view model will actually, try to decide, through the methods or properties or some commands to decide what kind of data piece I'm going to send it to the view. So view model is doing a lot of the central piece. And then so that you will see the two-way binding basically is happening between view model and the view, but view model is doing most of the work. Right? So a couple of things to point out is the view model and the view relationship is one to many. Meaning I could have one view model, but I could have multiple views. And then the view, every piece of view, does that sound better? Can you hear okay? All right. So if you look at a one-to-many, meaning every single view contains a reference of the view model. It could always reference to the view model. Whereas on the other hand, view model does not contain information about the views. It does not. It simply just providing the data, but doesn't have to care how many views will be there, right? So this is something you do want to sort of like really keep in mind when you having this MVVM, right? And the other thing is this is the pattern we do MVVM. All the frameworks I would be talking about is based on MVVM or what they call MV whatever, like Angular. Okay, so we have a little bit of time, so we could talk about a little more detail about design pattern. So afterwards, you will see there is a common agreement for all the frameworks. They have to make sure, do some serious JavaScript application, require the proper data model, as well as ability to do client-side rendering, not just the server-side rendering. So they will require at least the client-side rendering, not just the server-side. That's one thing. The other thing is a separation of model view, right? So the based on model view, whatever. They really have to have model and view, really. These two components, they have to have it in any of those frameworks. And then, we talk about MVC, MVVM, and all those patterns. Data binding is something they try to resolve, right? That's why they use this design pattern. So all the frameworks I'm talking about has a two-way binding except Backbone. Right? And then it's follow the open source license, MIT, and then mostly hosted on GitHub. So you could see all the frameworks in GitHub. Okay, so what are the popular JavaScript frameworks available? So I did a little the Google Trends thing. And you may not see it very clearly, but basically these, let's say 5 frameworks pop up. Obviously, the red one is AngularJS. AngularJS is probably one of the most popular frameworks nowadays. And as a matter of fact, you've heard several Angular sessions already, right? And then the follow-up with the Angular is Backbone, which is a purple line. And then I see both momentum from the blue line, which is Ember, as well as Meteor, the yellow one. And then the React, the green one, is actually catching up. You could see that. All right? So we're going to actually briefly go over it because it's only 75 minutes for this. Briefly go over each one of them, but focus on Angular and the Backbone later on. I would just try to put all the nice logos for each of the frameworks. It is a tough job. When you try to decide which one to use, it's not obvious as like look at all the icons, right? You could say, oh, I like one of the icon. Which one you like the best, the icon-wise? Ember, yeah, it's kind of cute, right? But in real life, it's not that easy, But obviously, logo is important, right? If you have a cute logo, more likely people is gonna say, yeah, let me look at Ember. What is that, right? So, but anyway, you probably want to see what is really the framework behind what they're gonna offer, right? So let's actually go over that really quickly. AngularJS is very sort of like a generic client-side kind of framework. And I'm not going to go over too much detail because I will talk about that in more detail later. But it's just probably good about just about everything in browser. Doesn't matter big scale or large scale. It's pretty good in general. Backbone is one of the very first JavaScript MVC kind of framework. Take it back, framework. And it's very simple. It is a combination of framework and the library. It's probably the simplest kind of like a framework we will see. And then, but obviously because it's so simple, so you still have to do quite a lot of what we call jQuery kind of classical, web development or thinking, because you have to do some low-level plumbing. What it does is basically pull out some of the DOM model into the Backbone specific model by using their like a Backbone model collection and so on. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So this is sort of something big. Other than that, Backbone is very much, if you know, how many of you do the jQuery programming, do the event handling, all those things? Yeah, then you probably get a Backbone already. It's not that much different. Ember, right? How many of you actually heard of Ember or using Ember? Okay. So Ember is really, I would say, it's probably a very full-blossom kind of framework. But it's very opinionated. right? It's actually developed by the Yehuda Katz, which is basically, you know, a lot of you are familiar with him from Rail and the Sprout core. So if you look at the core team is from him, right? So a lot of Ember's kind of concept is actually from the Rail and the Cocoa, right? So you could see that. And then it's really designed to use a convention over configuration, right? So it really, you know, help developer to be more productive, write a better code, and also improve the collaboration between different teams because it's all using same convention. I would say they have really top-notch routers and the URL. All those things are really implemented well in Ember. Very nice two-way binding, a lot of Ember directives, which Angular also use, but Ember does a lot of work. They use the template engine is use string-based, which is handlebars. That's what they use. I believe you have to use that, it's mandatory. Has very good community support. You could see a lot of questions on the Stack Overflow and RRC. The reason that there's a community support, I feel it's very important because for any of the technology or framework to survive longer, you need a community support, right? So a lot of times when I look at a new technology, if I don't really see a lot of community support or community behind, I'm probably not going to pay that much attention because I don't know how long that particular new piece is going to survive, right? So community support is important. However, Ember has probably one of the most steep learning curve. It's just way too much information. It's a lot to learn. It's a lot to get started with, right? And then sometimes I personally feel it's a little too much. It just try to tell you about everything. Learning curve is kind of hard. And then, but it's really good, you know, for the, what they call a long life application. If you have an administrator dashboard, you could keep a browser there for over hours. This is like an Ember specialty. A lot of people use that to develop an application fitting to that scenario, right? This is something Ember is good at. So obviously there's a lot of good things about Ember. So a lot of sites are already using that, but for detail, you could go through that link to check any of the real-life application using Ember. If you look at the code, right, it's really, I would say, convention over config, because you see a lot of things pretty familiar. They're defining their, the string-based template engine, right, which is the handlebars, they're finding there, and they use a div, goes through the cross, goes through the table fashion, and then they use expression like those for each. They use a double brackets to represent, and they also use like those author.name. Those things is actually, if you look at that, it's very much expression language. They do it in Ember, but you could see it in some other framework like Angular, all those things as well. So really, if you look at that, it's really, you know, not that difficult to really go through the text, go through the expression language, because it really follow the convention. But it does offer a lot, and especially the URLs are so important in Ember. If you try that, you will understand what I mean. So this is Ember, and we will do some of the key comparison later on. Meteor. How many of you heard about Meteor? I know there's a session, right? So Meteor is relatively new compared to the others, right? So it is really provide a full blossom stack. It has both the client-side container as well as the server side. It also have a mandatory database using Mongo, right? So the client side has a very nice container, and the server side is using Node, the Node container. So Meteor is probably one of those frameworks is provide both client, database, and the server, right? This is probably one of those things. It's I would say full stack. And the other thing is it's very good because if you look at that, it's very simple to develop. A lot of low-level prompting is taken care of for you. So in general, it should be very easy to get started with to develop some web component, for example. It does provide a mechanism called cached and synchronized data model. And the idea here is, have you heard about a WebSocket? So they basically use WebSocket. App use WebSocket a lot is like a chat applications using WebSockets, right? So both client and the server side, they're actually working on the synchronized object. This is one thing. The other thing is that Meteor is actually providing what we call live deployment, because any change in the client side, client actually will keep a local copy. and then it will try to sync with the server side. So because they have a local copy, so everything, update will be on the fly, meaning, they don't have to wait for the server side to push the response back. They could actually update all the GUI, all the UI on the client side immediately, right? So that's why they call it, it's a live deployment. It's very quick. You change anything, it's updated on the client side, even though server side may still thinking. And the community is good, right? So Meteor would be, I would think, another one. If you want to take a look at the full stack one, this is something you want to look into. Okay, so I think you look a little puzzled when I talk about all kind of frameworks. Perhaps this diagram will give you a little bit a better idea between different kind of frameworks. So I listed 4 frameworks: Angular, Backbone, Ember, and Meteor. I didn't put a React there because React is, strictly speaking, is not a framework. It's a library, I would say, right? So if you look at a data binding, very cool, right? All the frameworks has two-way data binding. The only one doesn't have is Backbone. If you look at all the view templates, you will see most of them, right? Like a Backbone, most likely use underscore or handlebars, because Backbone is very flexible. You could have put a lot of those template engine as your choice. Ember and Meteor, they are both use a stream-based one, and it's mandatory. They actually use the handlebars. They all use that. Angular is the only one is using a template engine we call it DOM-based, right? So probably you will ask, what's the difference? DOM-based is very much natural, work with a DOM, CSS, all those markup. And then the stream-based is basically the external kind of stream template engine. And then although it's debatable, but a lot of people feel the stream-based template is performance-wise is very good, plus all the stream-based, all the server, it's agnostic of the server. All the server could pass all the strings. That's the argument to use stream-based. But then the Angular is using DOM-based. The reason is, I would say one of the reasons is probably because now it's owned by Google, right? So the Google actually really wanted to have the DOM-based thing native for their browser. So that is why they are pushing this DOM-based templates in their particular template engine. So, but other than that, it's all stream-based, right? So that's a little difference here. The URL routing is basically trying to support the back button, right? Almost all of them has a support. It's a built-in support. However, Ember and Meteor has a mandatory support. It's already there, and whereas Angular and Backbone is kind of optional. It doesn't really, you don't have to really provide it in the core package, but you could always find something to support that. Data storage is another piece you usually look at a framework. So if you look at that, right, any other framework, when you look at it, people usually care about the data binding. People look at the performance, the view templates, the engine, right, what they use. People look at some features like a back button because it's a single page application. Then you look at the URL routing. The other thing is people look at is data storage, obviously, right? So if you look at that, I would say Meteor is the mandatory one. They already sort of like have the MongoDB database in place. So this is how they do the storage, and it's required, it's a Mongo, right? And then the rest of the system is, Angular is a little more relaxed. It's very optional, you don't really have to provide it in the framework itself. Whereas the Backbone and Ember, they do have the built-in data storage mechanism, but it's overridable, right? So you may concern about what is the data storage. Let me actually talk a little bit more. Data storage is basically say how you're gonna sync with the server side. Right? For the client side, it's very simple. What they do is they do AJAX call through a RESTful web service, right? And then they will get a JSON data back. That's how they could actually sync with the server side. And this is actually, we talk about a data storage, that's how they do it, right? Right? Sounds good? Right. Okay. Okay, so one of the last kind of like on the list is React. I'm sure you heard about a lot of React. React is actually developed by Facebook. And like I said, strictly speaking, it's not really a framework. If you really want to put this piece of library or module into the framework, I would say it represents V in MVC. It's a view. And React could work perfectly with Angular or Backbone or some other frameworks because it's just doing the view. The whole idea behind is we want to have a better rendering in the DOM object. So performance is the #1 concern for React, right? So basically they make it super fast because regularly we do the DOM, we have to do the whole DOM manipulation, all those rendering. But for React, it only do the change, the difference in the DOM. So that's why it could be super fast. And the React, if you start to look into that, it's very, very easy to use. It's a very short learning curve. That's why it's really catch up a momentum, getting more and more popular. In the way they could make it really fast, only render what's changed is because they have what we call virtual DOM. The virtual DOM basically is like a mirror of actual DOM, but they maintain all the DOM state. They will do the snapshot, find out the difference of that DOM. They will even do the accumulative of the change. So if you have several changes, they're smart enough not to actually, update all the change or rendering all the change. They will actually do, combine all the change, give it the final one. That is why performance-wise, React is really good. And I would say probably one of the drawback is you do have a new file called a JSX. So this is a combination of HTML, JavaScript. So now, because we already have in the files, right? CSS, HTML, JavaScript. But with React, you have another type called a JSX. So you have to sort of just live with that, understand the syntax and all those things. Right? But other than that, I think it's a very easy framework to get started with. But it's not, strictly speaking, a framework, it's just a library. Okay, so I'd like to actually give you some questions to think about. Because you attended this session because you want to get a little overview of all the web frameworks. But on the other hand, you really have to think about how much do you want to use a framework or library? What is the framework you want to use? Do you want to start from scratch, from blank one, or you want some framework to provide you the predefined architecture? Yeah, and also you want to think about, maybe you could have your own framework. You could have a combination of the pattern and the library of your choice instead of using a full Blossom framework. That's another choice, right? And then I would say probably you want to actually think about not just look at a description or the feedback or the review or the feature list of that framework, but think about what exactly you want. Those things are good. All the reading, all those things are good. But still, you have to try it. I would say probably start with a very simple prototype. Try it to see if that's what you want. Because a lot of them require pretty steep learning curve. It is quite a bit of investment, right? I like to say, I said a developer's life is like an ever-catching game. We have all the new technology, new frameworks, even new languages all the time, right? And you have to be smart enough to pick what will work the best for you. Not just go with hyper stuff, because it's hot, that's why we're getting into it. But take a look, see if it's really, some skill set or something you needed, right? Yeah, and then your own coding experience is also very important because, for example, some people just say, I'm pretty happy with the jQuery kind of classical web development. I'm an architect already. I feel happy. I have much better control. Totally fine. You don't have to use any frameworks. That's totally fine. Okay, so some things for you to think about. All right, so did a quick intro. And I'd like to move on to the Angular backbone. Before I go any further, any questions? All right, good. Okay. So let's actually, before I get started with, how many of you already have exposure to Angular backbone? Okay, good. Okay, so this is basically a review slide, right? So both of it's a client-side framework, and both using the MV design pattern. We talked about that before. They try to resolve the single-page application based on how do you want to do structure, how you want to lay out your module, how you're going to support multiple clients. All those things we talked about in the previous slide. And again, both open source and really has a concept of view, events, models, and erotic. Both frameworks has all those modules there already. Little bit of history. Angular was born in 2009, so it's actually 6 years ago. It started with a project called Get Angular, and Misko Havry is a Google developer at the time, and he did something really amazing, turned a web application from 17K lines of code, usually developed in 6 months, into 1,000 lines of code in 3 weeks by using the project called Get Angular. So this is really something, it's very amazing. It's getting a lot of attention from Google, and then Google start to sponsor the project. So now become AngularJS. Now, it's in production with Google. Google owns it, right? We all know that. So this is probably one of the big reasons why Angular is so popular these days, right? Google is behind. Backbone was born a year later, 2010. Very, very lightweight. It's like I said, it's the very first MVC framework. Very, very lean. It's using the MVVM, and then, but it's not like heavy at all. It's very lean, very simple, very small. And compared to some like heavy framework we used before, like external JS, those are kind of MVC, but it's huge. So immediately it's getting a lot of attention, Backbone, because it's so small, so easy to get started with. And then next is learning curve, right? So if you look at different frameworks, it's always good to look at their learning curve, because that's the investment you're going to put. Angular. I would say Angular is a kind of thing like a loving first sight. Yes, it's a pretty good, easy to get started with, to do something simple. But then once you get into have more complexity, you will feel the learning curve is actually quite steep. There's a lot of things to learn, all right? And it's highly opinionated. Angular has a lot of their own way to define the architecture, define the different modules, define the language, define the vocabulary. An Angular way of thinking, right? If you look at that, we have a classical jQuery kind of event handling, all those thinking. Angular has their own way to do the Angular thinking. So this is something you want to sort of get used to. And also, people still think a lack of examples, right? So all the code I'm talking about Angular today is 1.x, right? And then this will be something, could be a challenge if things move on to 2.x. Let's see how Google is going to support that, right? Let's see that. Backbone, on the other hand, is very basic. It is not opinionated at all. It doesn't really have, I guess it has just a little bit, maybe model is kind of new concept, but other than that, it doesn't have any new vocabulary. Everything is, like I said, if you understand jQuery programming, all the DOM manipulation, all the event handling, you know Backbone. So you don't really have to spend a lot of time to learn that. However, Backbone provides a lot of flexibility for you to use with different kind of third-party libraries. For that part, it does need some learning curve and research time. Why? Because you have to choose which third-party library you want to use, isn't it? So this, in that sense, yes, there's a little bit of research and learning curve as well. Okay, community support. Like I said, I always look for those data behind. It all looks good. Good stars on GitHub. Third-party modules, Stack Overflow questions, YouTube, as well as GitHub contribution, Chrome extension. All of them are good. But then in general, I would say Angular probably has better support than Backbone. So it could be because it's more popular, more people use it, or also could it be because the framework itself is more complex, so people have more questions on Stack Overflow. So, but overall, both are good. Okay, now let's look at a little like comparison table between Angular and the Backbone. Architecture-wise, like I said, Angular is based on MVC, but it's not, there's no C there. There's no controller module there. It has a MV, model view, whatever kind of pattern. It has a controller functions, but it doesn't have a controller module. Whereas a Backbone is based on MVVC. So it's basically, this is really, strictly speaking, Backbone is strictly based on a design pattern. Template support. The template, what I mean is the template engine. Yes, Angular is really sort of like a mandatory. It has to go with underneath a DOM-based template engine. As a matter of fact, Angular doesn't allow any other template engine. You cannot swap, right? Whereas backbone is more flexible. It's usually use underscore, but you could also use handlebars, right? So it's more flexible in that sense. Backbone always has to go with one of the what they call the template engine, right? So because of that, it has to usually go with underscore. So because of that, a lot of time people say, the file size, the library size for backbone is so small. Look at it, it's only 6.5K to start with. However, because backbone has to work with the underscore, has to put a jQuery library, if you're adding those things together, it comes out about a 43K. So it's pretty similar as the Angular size. I wouldn't say one is definitely smaller than the other. Angular, basically say I could have run it by myself. But most of the time, Angular still go with jQuery library, right? Even though Angular claim I don't have to use jQuery, but I see most of the time in real life, people use jQuery and Angular. But again, all the library size, all the file size are very small. Nested template support, this is something interesting. Angular has, okay, so for example, if I have a template, like my name, Doris is my first name, Chen is my last name. Angular has a very easy way you could separate Doris first name, Chen is last name. Whereas Backbone doesn't have those nested template. They only take Doris Chen, the whole name. And if you want to separate first name, last name, you have to implement your own way to do that. So it's not very convenient in the nested template aspect of Backbone. Data binding, perhaps this is really one of the shortcomings. Backbone itself doesn't provide a data binding. If you want a data binding, you probably need to go for the third-party library offer to go with Backbone. Angular has a built-in two-way binding. So this is really one of the good things about Angular. Angular provides, in general, a lot more resource and features. For example, routing, right? Routing both has it. But like Angular provides additional features such as dependency injection, right? Directives, it's actually very, very strong in Angular. The expression two-way binding I talked about, HTML validation, both from the client side as well as to the server side, and doing the filtering and the service. All those things is provided in the Angular framework itself, so you don't have to worry about that. Whereas Backbone doesn't really have any of those. All right. Okay. All right, templates. So if you look at it, let's actually go through the templates for both Angular and the Backbone. So before I do that, I like to actually show you a quick demo. I actually use a to-do app implemented both in Angular and Backbone, and we could go through the code in more detail later. So this is the to-do app. I use Angular. And let me actually just run it so you see what's going on. And again, both Angular and Backbone, they will support across browsers. So regardless of what browser you use, they have very similar look and feel. So this is running on Windows 10 in the default browser called Edge. How many of you actually have tried Edge? Okay, very good. So this is something, is basically it's a to-do app list. And you could do a few things. You could say, I'm actually doing presentation now. This is my to-do list. And then once you generate that a new item to your list, you could actually decide to say, am I done with the presentation? Or this is already done, I'm gonna remove it from the list. So you could actually do two things, cross it over and then remove it from the list. And then obviously, this application also take care the storage, the persistence data on the back. So in this case is a client-side persistence. So for example, if I close this browser, basically I close, right? It's all the sessions are gone. And I do it again. And you will see all the data are there, right? Just like before. So it's all saved in the client side. Again, it's in the local storage. It's in the browser itself. But then again, those data could be also goes through into the database or cloud very easily as well. Yes. This is not just a framework security concern. It's a web application concern. So it is very true. You always have to do, say, for the performance, for the really like user experience, you keep a copy of the data cache locally, but all the highly confidential data, all the data always have to get a copy on the server side for persistence. You always have to do that, no exception, right? So you always have to do both, but a lot of framework handle things differently. They could do it in what we call connected mode or disconnected mode. Disconnected mode is pretty popular. They keep a copy on local because on the mobile device, sometimes you may not using the data plan, right? So you actually do a disconnected mode. So you have a local copy, so locally you could actually change all those things, feed the new data. But at the same time, once you have a data connection, you always have to do the persistence on the server side, right? So, and then once you have the local copy, that's totally fine. It's just for user experience, for the performance, but then the data backend persistence, you always have to do that. You always have to sync with the server. So the security part, yes, I don't think it's a good idea to put a highly confidential information on the client side associated with the browser, for example, right? And then it should be put it on the server. As a matter of fact, you should also do encryption. You should also think about those ciphers, all those things, do encryption. That's actually necessary. I could not hear you very well. Maybe I could save your question towards the end. You could use a microphone in the front, right? So I'd like to go on with that, and then could go back to your question, right? All right, so, and then this is, I just use the Edge and to see. And I want to actually show you the same app I developed to use Backbone, right? And we could see, let's say we could actually use Chrome, right? So if you look at that, and then obviously the items, with different, this is use Backbone, but if you look at a look and feel, you couldn't tell if it was use Angular or Backbone, right? And then you could exactly do same thing, like maybe I have Microsoft Boost Studio later on or something, you could put and you could cross it over or delete it, all those things, and the persistence also saved in the backend as well, right? So if you look at those persistence, it actually goes with the browser. Right, so let's actually go back to where I am, which is Chrome. Because it's a local storage, it's per browser based. So this makes you think, what if I want a persistence across all browsers? Then the good way to do that is put it on the server. Do the backend persistence. When you do a local persistence, it always goes with your browser. Okay, so this is an application we implement. It's called To-Do app, and let's actually go on with the code. So if you look at that, this is actually how we're doing the template in Angular, right? Very simple. It's a simple HTML with some of the binding expressions. And then if you look at the framework, for example, if I want to have a framework description, they use double brackets. So framework.description is where you can actually see the description of that framework. And then framework.name is where you're going to see the name of that. So it's always expression with double brackets, curly braces, sorry. So this is for the Angular. And then move on to the Backbone, how they do the templates. It's slightly different. It's using underscore. But underscore is very basic. So basically, it's sort of getting into a little JavaScript kind of mixer with HTML. So if you look into that, the way they do the expression or templates is if you do things like a framework description, they use the percentage, right? The bracket and the percentage, and then this is where you put a framework description. This is basic JavaScript in HTML, right? So this is just a mixture. This is how they do the expression. So that's why I said a Backbone is very similar like the jQuery programming. It's really not that much difference. Okay, so you may like Angular way because it's more clean, it's more readable, right, compared to Backbone. The other thing move on to is a model for the Angular. People say, what kind of model have to implement in Angular? As a matter of fact, Angular doesn't really enforce you to implement something called a model. Angular is use observable properties. There's no restriction or implementation on the model object itself. Angular could just very simply use what we call POJO, plain old JavaScript object. As a matter of fact, Angular could leverage the POJO objects from Backbone or from some other frameworks. As long as a POJO objects, Angular could work with that. So model part of Angular is very flexible. It doesn't really require to implement a getter or setter. No such methods. It's just flexible POJO objects. Compared to Angular, Backbone is, requires a little more. This is probably the thing sort of like a Backbone will enforce you to do, which is implement a model. And it has a Backbone model you need to implement. And in this case, it's a to-do kind of list. And you will see there's a couple of things like the title of that item I want to put. And then there will be a boolean to determine if that item is done or not. So I could have put a crossover or the green one or the red cross. And then there's a location. If you want to actually record the location, you could do that. And this is basically how they implement a model object. And then there's one JavaScript function called toggle completed. This could be implemented in the model, that level as well in the Backbone implementation. Now, in addition to a model, this could be a single to-do item, right? It also will sort of like ask you to implement a collection. Collection is basically a container of a list of items there. So you have to actually implement a collection and using what the Backbone collection API. This is what you need to do, right? So, so basically, model and Backbone model, Backbone collection, these are the two things you have to implement it if you use Backbone. But again, Backbone does not provide a two-way binding. So it does not actually using observable kind of functionality. So you still have to, when you do a reset or when you do a change in the model and a view model, you have to implement all your routine. Backbone does not provide that, right? So this is actually one thing you want to really watch out when you do the Backbone implementation. Then we'll go back, so we talk about the template engine, we talk about model implementation, then we actually go back to say a few things about Angular, a few good things. Some of them is a review, providing two-way binding, dependency injection is there, using a lot of directives, both the existing one provided by the Angular or customized directives, which we'll show you in the next session. And also provide a lot of reusable service, filters, factories, leverage all the patterns, provide all those nice features for you to use. And one big thing is you don't have to do low-level plumbing. Not like a Backbone, you have to do a lot of event handling, DOM manipulation. All those things is hidden inside, or it's already provided by Angular itself. There is also a feature to do dirty checking, meaning you don't have to really do get and setter. It's all provided inside Angular. And you could actually have the two-way binding. So Angular uses observable pattern to detect the change and notify all the watchers. This is already there. So this is called dirty checking. If you want to see some dirty checking sometimes, this is what it means in Angular implementation. So this is an example of Angular doing two-way binding and directives. Let me just point out a few things to you. Angular, like I said, use a lot of directives. Its directive always started with ng dash. So in this particular case, we have a lot of to-do items, right? We list a lot of to-do items. So it uses a directory called ng-repeat. And then putting the to-do item, each of the to-do item represents a single to-do item in to-dos. To-dos is like a collection. It's holding all the to-do item. Now, one cool thing about that is you don't really have to define to-do item or to-dos anywhere else. Once you use ng-repeat, people knows first one is a single item. The in something, that means it's a collection of that single items. So that's all defined in Angular. And then you could see if we want to cross out that particular to-do item, it has a very nice ng-class to go with a CSS property called a cross out. And then to-do item.done represents a boolean, if it's I should do it or I should not do it, right? And then there's also another thing called ng-model. It's defined in Angular, so you could actually show what is content of that particular item. So in this case, is to-do item, which is you actually sort of like defining here the text, the detail of that. So all those things is already implemented in the AngularJS itself. So when you see, this is basically the HTML page. When you see there's it's not exactly HTML tag, but it's rather describe the behavior of that HTML. So it's kind of like you have to think about how Angular defining the problem, but it's in a way, you have to agree it is pretty readable. Because even though you don't see the whole application, even though you don't see the demo I showed before, you could sort of picture what it's like on the screen, right, in the browser. So this is actually pretty nicely done in Angular. I don't have time to go through detail, but then there's a few more good things about using filters, factories, all those nice things in Angular. And then perhaps the worst to mention is the promise pattern. How many of you heard about a promise pattern? Yeah, promise pattern is very, very useful in JavaScript these days. It actually used a lot in Angular framework. So basically, if you have an AJAX kind of call, the promise pattern will allow you to set up all the condition. You could even set up a timeout to wait, all those things. So you have much better control about those calls. So promise pattern is really, really easy to use. If you never sort of like use that, give it a try. Okay, I want to actually switch the gear just a little bit because directives are playing a very important role in Angular. I want to show you one of the examples I used to develop a customer directive. So like I said, all the existing directives inside Angular is started with ng, right? So this is the name convention of ng. So here, what I want to do is, remember when I actually, let me actually show this one more time. If I do just to-do item, what I want to do is, I want to actually change this particular item, right? Pack luggage. Example. That, right? So you could actually change that particular item inside a to-do list. This is the one I actually developed a particular customized directive to do that. Okay, so the one I called is called ng-text-change. That's my customized directive. That's not predefined in Angular. It's not there. And then associated with a JavaScript function called change to do text. And then what I want to point out is the syntax of using that. Now, here is called ng- kind of fashion. And when you actually implement it in the directive, there is a keyword called directive inside Angular. And you could implement that. It's actually called ng-text change. So one is kind of dash fashion, one is kind of camel kind of fashion. So you have to remember, change this name convention. Otherwise, you will never fly. So this is probably a good tip for you because a lot of people ask me, say, hey, I have a really nice customized directive. Why it doesn't work? Well, I said it because the name convention. You did not, pay attention to that. But this could be the shortcoming of Angular, right? Why they have such a kind of like a different name convention for the same thing. So, but you have to sort of pay attention to those things. Okay, so when you're defining this directive, a few things you need to do. You need to define the scope, the restrictive of that particular nature of the text change. Here I put A, that means it's attribute. Attribute meaning the to-do item, I'm just changing the text. I'm not changing the font. I'm not changing the color. I'm not changing the look and the feel. I'm only changing the text, right? From pack to pack luggage. So I'm just changing the attribute. So that's why I put A here. If you actually want to change the look and feel, the color, the font, and a lot more things, then you need to put E, represents element. Of course, you could also put a cross. That means it's a cross level kind of change. So these things you need to define in the restricted level. And then in my case, it's simple. I just change the model. It's called ng model. Basically, it's that a particular to-do item object, right? And then I'm just using this is very Angular way. They're going to do, based on that scope, they're going to apply all those things. Going to take the ng text change, the content from the box, right? And then just change it. Scope is also something pretty popular used in Angular. If you're from object-oriented programming background, you're you're used to scope, it's not a big deal for you. But then if you are really started with JavaScript front-end kind of engineer, then you may have to have a difficult time to understand what do you mean scope, right? So these are the things you probably have to spend a little time to learn and get used to in Angular. Okay, so again, I talked about quite a few good things about Angular. Let's talk about something not so good, which is basically Angular is extremely opinionated. You already see that, right? They have their own way to do the expression. They have their own directives. They have their scope, right? They have their name convention. They have to sort of let you to think about the Angular way to present your HTML. All those things is Angular way. So it's very opinionated. And then could it be very complicated and odd? Because sometimes, for example, you have a jQuery library. You have the Angular. Some of the keyword, you don't know if you're using the jQuery or you're using Angular. So you have to sort of find out what's behind, what's the difference. So these are things you have to sort of look into. One of the complaints for Angular, I think, is their expression language. It is way too powerful. This is all correct. This piece of statement is good. If you do it correctly, it is running, it is working. However, if you think about it, you ever make a simple typo or mistake in the middle of that, it would be extremely hard to debug, right? Because the expression language-wise, it's all legitimate, it's all fine. But then in reality, it's just a little too hard to do it, right? So this is something I would compare as not so good. Scope could be confusing, I talked about that before. Some people didn't really like the concept of scope. And then it does need, it would be nice to have more built-in support to simplify the framework itself, to make it more easy to get started with and to do. Okay, so we talked about good things about Angular, customized directive, and a few bad things about Angular. Let me actually start with the good things about a backbone, right? Move on to backbone. Backbone is not opinionated at all. It is so simple, it's straightforward, it's very classical way to do the event handling, all the web programming, and then very, very at the least learning curve, I would say. Among all the frameworks I talk about, Backbone is probably has the least learning curve. Big community support, has a lot of those applications running, recognize Twitter, Foursquare, Pandora, and a lot more. It's already used that. Not so good is too hands-off. Backbone does not really help you to do the architecture design, even though it is based on MVVC. But it is really hands-off. You really actually have to design the architecture. You have to think about how you actually put different things in different modules. You have to think about how to do the memory management. You have to really clean up a lot of things so that you don't have any memory leaks. Those things you really have to keep in consideration. And then also the third-party plugin. This is something you have to think about, because if you don't want to implement a lot of the optional package, like a two-way binding, right? You have to use a third-party library to do that. Then it does involve some learning curve, because you have to decide which one would be a good one to use. No nested model, I talked about that before. It's like a first name, last name. You have to implement it yourself, not like something so straightforward, right? You're so used to just get a name first, last. You cannot do that in Backbone. You have to do your own. But perhaps one of the strongest sort of complaint people says is low level. You have to do all the DOM manipulation directly. You have to handle all the low level permitting. This is something people complain, right? So something good could be something bad. It's easy to learn, but then there's a lot of things you have to do it yourself, right? So because of no data binding, this is typically if you want to do a Flash to do, that's how you have to do it, right? You have to grab all those the specific DOM and then change all the content, and then do the input, putting all the toggle, put all those things. This is just one of the routine. Try to do all the refresh and DOM manipulation, because there's no two-way binding there. You have to do it yourself. The other thing is, if you compare Angular to Backbone, is let's see how they actually handle the cross-out, how they work with the CSS, that particular property. With a Backbone, you have to do a classical way. You have to actually get a model, get it done, which is booting. You want to decide if the to-do item need to cross out or not. So this is how you actually have to do that. You have to call this input, right? DOM and then adding a class called a cross out, or you want to remove the class and then remove that one. So these things you have to do it in Backbone. Whereas in the Angular, it's quite a bit of, easier. They're defining the ng directive called ng class. They associate the property called cross out with that boolean called to do item.done. And then based on that, you could decide what you want to do, right? So I'm just to show you the highlighted piece is something Backbone is handled in the DOM way and Angular is handled using the directive. Okay, so this is something quite different. Okay, performance. I used to do a lot of JavaScript performance tuning, so I always care about the performance. Now, it will depend on your benchmark. All I tell you, this particular one is based on MVC, based on the to-do app we did. So the experiment is like this. We purposely adding one at a time for 100 to-do items, and then delete one at a time from the list. This is what we do. And then 10 runs for the average. Data is collected on such MacBook and under that particular OS with this hardware configuration. And the average response time is taken from Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. And then you could look for more detail. The last link could give you the performance detail, the benchmark, and there's a lot of other data there. But for this to-do MVC benchmark, we do see Backbone is actually faster than Angular. All right, I guess some people will feel a little surprised, right? So it's almost, AngularJS takes almost like twice as much time than the Backbone. It's the same app we're doing, right? But maybe you have different tests, you will get a different result, right? So I'd like to actually share with you a little bit of code. We may not have time for everything, but let's actually go through the Angular. How's that? So Angular, if you look at the whole piece, by the way, Angular is about, in this to-do app, it's about 200 lines of code. Backbone is about 300 lines of code. So in lines of code, Angular seems like the winner here. And if you look at here, I have a very simple just index.html. And then you put all the, this is very similar like what I just showed you before. With a to-do new item, you have a placeholder to put what needs to be done. And using ng text change, I talked about before, to change the text. And then we'll just go through that list to show all the to-do items in the list, right? And this is a few things. It's very similar like when we talk about the code, right? We have the basically the ng repeat, which is here. We have the class to defining to associate with if that particular to-do item should be later on should be crossed out or still stay there. There is something with a little button. There's a little click to remove that items. You know, all those things is defining in the HTML level, right? So this is one thing. And if you read that, it's pretty easy to read. So this is the HTML for to-do app. The script is also pretty simple. So there will be some Angular libraries inside of the framework itself. And then there is one called the controller. There's a controller function. And the controller function is, like I said, Angular doesn't have a controller module, but it does have controller function. So the controller function is actually in here, it handles a few things. First of all, it's handle the local storage. So you try to get a local storage. And then if you want to show the sort of like a coordinate of XY coordinate, the geolocation, you could do that. And you could also, you know, then it's actually a matter of, you know, you add the to-do item into it, you get the address, you do all those push the to-do, work with the local storage, and so on. And then clean up all the items and toggle the button, modified. So this is all taken care in the to-do controller kind of function. There is another one worth mentioning is a service. What is the service? This is where you handle the local storage as well. Could be how to do it, like I could push the data into the cloud, right? For what we call the server side, the backend persistence. This is what I do in the service. So in the service here, I'm using local storage. So I use the random generator to get the random ID, the geo ID, right? And then just do a little math to getting all the unique ID. And then I actually use a factory method to work with a key called local storage. This is basically HTML5 local storage for each browser. And then based on that, again, I do things like a local load all the things from the storage. So when I clean up the browser, when I close the browser, when we reopen the browser, it has to load all the items from the local storage so that it will see all the to-do items there. Save to the storage, and then basically just get all of them, create a new item, update one, all those things, right? So this is pretty typical when you do work with the storage, deleted item, right? And then you could actually here, this is where you could, if I want to add some cloud storage on the back, I could actually leverage what we call Azure Mobile Service, which is a RESTful call. I could actually use a factory method and then just get rid of all those uncomment out all the Azure service. So basically it's getting Azure service, getting injected to getting the particular key term from the Azure table, and then you could just put a sort of like a dump the local storage into it. So this is how you could actually do in the Azure very easily. And then you could also handle the address if you have a geolocation, all those things add on top of that. So this is what a service do. Back-end, local storage, and then the controller function I did is actually just everything is in. So basically to JavaScript, you could actually implement this to-do items. So very simple. I have about 4 minutes left. Would you like to see maybe this particular app running in a phone, or you want to just leave it for Q&A? Okay, I'll just show it really quickly. So I'm running out of time, but basically what I'm trying to show here is we could move this application, just do a copy and a paste into what we call Cordova, which is using JavaScript to develop cross-devices kind of application. So how many of you heard about Cordova? Yeah, so you could actually use a single code base, which is based on HTML, JavaScript, same code I showed before in the browser. And then using all the Cordova plugin and all the device capability, you could actually port the app into iOS, Android, and Windows, right? And then obviously the challenge here is takes a while to getting all the devices ready or all the packages ready. What I'm using here is I'm using Visual Studio 2015. This is a community edition, which is a free edition anybody could download. I use a particular one called Developer Cordova. So you could actually just go to a project, maybe you never use Visual Studio, but it provides a lot of template. In this case, I use something called a blank apps, which is Apache, Cordova, and I create a new project. Afterwards, I copy all the web code I showed it before into this project. And then one thing I did is I tried to actually put a little bit native behavior, which is through this config.xml. This will provide you a lot of additional package like a camera, battery capture, motion, accelerometers, all those kind of like a hardware feature which you could not do it in the browser, right? I added a package into it. And then I just changed the code just a tiny bit. What I did is I added a little like a shaking. I said I don't want to delete all the item one at a time. I'm adding a little package using accelerometer and then just shake that device and hopefully we'll get rid of all the items, right? So in that, what's cool about this tool is not just editor. It's a part you could actually develop all Android, iOS, Windows, tablet, phones, everything in the same IDE. And then for example, I choose Android, right? And then I could pick multiple emulator device from Android. And for the time being, I'll just show you something I already opened because I don't have time to generate all. So I could share with you, this is the Android emulator. I don't know, it seems like a little dark, but you see the to-do apps there. And this is actually running in the Android emulator. This is Android device. And I could actually, do a lot of things. I could remove it just like I do in a browser. I could add new things into it, right? And this is really Android, emulator device. And then we will maybe take a little while. And you will see that this is a nice emulator. You could do a lot of things. And it could also do it in emulator called KitKat, kind of emulator. It's an Android device. And then what's cool about that is this is the same, to-do application. And then you could actually add in the touch, so I could actually really touch it instead of use the mouse. And then you could do the rotation, right? Just like a regular emulator. And you could even get in the two part, which is you could actually mimic the accelerometer doing a shake, like here, right? So it's a shaking, and hopefully the items will be all cleaned up after the shake. Let me try one more time. Okay, it's all gone, right? So I could mimic the shake of the phone and then get rid of all the items. So basically, what I'm introduced here is you could use Visual Studio Cordova kind of plugin to develop a mobile application without really changing your web application that much, and then take care of all the hardware really easily. Okay, so running out of time, I'll just show you the resource so you could actually get in more information. So this is a resource. If you want to get more design patterns in JavaScript, the first link will give you a lot of those things. Second link is a to-do MVC kind of website, and it's a really cool website. I actually highly recommend if you never see that. This is a website with a to-do app, but they use different kind of framework, like a backbone. If you look at the Angular, Ember, Knockout, Polymer, CanJS, all those things. All those framework has an implementation. They will do the same thing, implement a to-do app. So you could actually go to that site, take a look at the detail, and compare different framework, get some feeling about that. And then I think I could go back to the resource page, and the rest of them is going a little bit deeper onto a comparison of the framework, and then each of different kind of like a framework. And the last link is tools for Apache Cordova, and you could look into that to find out how you could add that Cordova support into the Visual Studio. And then I guess I'm running out of time, but I will stay here a little bit for the question. Thank you very much.